thank you for your very kind welcome. And I'm already inspired by the incredible array of topics that we've heard about in the welcome, and in understanding how many countries are represented in the room and online for a conference such as this. So it really is quite a remarkable activity. There's some conferences focus on one narrow theme, and I understand that that's important, especially in certain areas where there's a pressing issue that needs to be resolved, and where that hyper-specialised community needs to focus in and do that work together. But I think the theme that we've been hearing about and that we've been attracted to of belonging and community requires us to find those connections across our different areas in ways that's quite possibly unique in the arts and humanities, or at least it's a special feature. So I'd also like to add my thanks to all of the organisers, the contributors, the volunteers, the chairs, and especially to you, the audience here, and those who are participating virtually. It takes a huge effort to organise an event like this, so it's a privilege to be here. Where's that change? So I'm going to be talking about the topic of the power of digital, looking at a particular aspect of it which relates to cultural narratives of enslavement and resistance. And I'm going to speak about first about a project that has inspired this kind of interest in this work for me and for a team of people around me, not necessarily only at my own university but across the world as these sort of collaborations emerge. And then I'm going to move in the middle of the talk to talking about this field of digital historical migration studies, and the sort of framing idea of this field that's to do with the movement of people, and it's a lot of digital work that's now going on behind it, which is really very much to do with building community. And then later on, I'm going to return to this particular project. So I'll just get going. So digital innovations have led to new data-driven methods and the creation of vast online resources in the humanities. And this talk will focus on what we could call digital historical migration studies, and it'll focus in particular on an Australian Research Council funded project on the development of digital tools for biographical narratives and data relating to the legacies of British slavery in Australia. So as part of a team developing digital and publicly accessible modes to present this research, including an online exhibition, we're exploring ways of telling the story of slavery in a virtual space. So this talk will identify some of the many new approaches and methods in digital storytelling being used in digital humanities and heritage projects about slavery, with reference to some examples. And it'll pay particular attention to digital mapping, and specifically the use of an Australian Research Council infrastructure called the Time Layered Cultural Map, or TLC map, which allows humanities researchers to input their own raw data into an integrated system. So this Western Australian Slavery Legacy Project is a national collaborative project tracing the movement of people, property and capital from Britain to Western Australia, exploring how there were links between slavery in the British Empire and settler colonialism. So central questions for the project have been how important was the legacy of British slavery for the colonisation of Western Australia, and why has it been overlooked? At the point of emancipation in the 1830s, what routes did capital and people involved in slavery elsewhere follow to the newly established colonies? So it's a sort of fascinating historical project, but my real main role in it has been to think about the translation of the research that we've been doing into digital and online forms of communication. Yeah, the project itself initially grew out of of this project from University College London, the Legacies of British Slavery project, which started by tracing the £20 million in compensation money paid out to British slavers following abolition of slavery in 1833. And it identified 46,000 claimants, as well as thousands of plantations and estates. And all of this data is now publicly available on the LBS online database. You can find names of people, professions, activities, affiliation of men and women who were slave owners, attorneys, names of locations, plantations and estates. So this vast sort of integrated online resource that is fully searchable and has been developed over the past 20 years or so. This kind of data, looking at the movement of people and distribution of networks, lends itself also to mapping and geographic visualizations. And so in around 2021, our Slavery Legacies project team began talks with the lead investigators of this time-layered cultural map, and I'm involved with this project too, about ways of visualizing and analyzing the movements of individuals connected to slavery using this digital infrastructure. And I'll return to that a little bit later and show some examples. Oops. I keep pressing the button too quickly, I think. But that's okay. So this work can be more broadly situated within this growing field of digital historical migration studies more broadly. Related to, but distinct from digital history or digital cultural heritage studies, it aims to develop new understandings of the migration experience, whether that be voluntary migration, forced migration, as in the case of slavery, or other forms of especially historical migration, other than modern movement of people. So migration and the mass movement of people has been accelerating around the world along with the macro processes of globalization. Since the late 20th century, these trends have been supported and enabled by parallel developments in information communications technology and computing. And of course, just as sort of an aside, that was a remarkable thing for diaspora and for migrant communities around the world to connect and to belong. The use of digital technologies and platforms, and so their later social media. I'm talking about slavery and other sorts of, really complex and, traumatic kinds of migration experiences today. Digital platforms have offered, great hope for communities to connect in new ways and to also recognise those prior traumatic experiences and to begin sometimes to reconcile them. So access to new data is one of the core drivers and foundations for this digital study of migration, whether that be approaches to cultural, literary, historical, linguistic or other data. Data sets available to researchers are expanding and diversifying, going well beyond numbers and metrics of people, places and dates. At a recent international migration conference and network meeting, researchers drew on and analysed data to investigate topics as varied as relationships between migration policy, the subjective well-being of non-immigrant populations in Europe, aspirations of refugee children who have arrived in Greece, and barrier opportunities facing economic migrants during the COVID-19 pandemic in the Czech Republic, among many other topics that were covered in this conference. But there was also this about that I mentioned about social media and the opportunities to think about social media and devices such as phones as lifelines and tools for connecting migrants and maintaining relationships. But as I offer more on historical. So the digitisation of archival material has also laid further foundations for research. Projects by state museums, archives and collecting bodies in particular have targeted materials relevant to migration histories. In Australia, an early and large-scale example of such a project was the Western Australian Museum's retrospective digitisation of what are called TIIKM walls in 2012. So physical walls that comprise over 400 panels with the names inscribed of more than 45,000 migrants who arrived at the port of Fremantle, where I now live in Western Australia. Inscriptions are based on user-contributed data. Registration forms detail key information on migrants and were completed by community members. And much of this has now been translated to digital forms so that it is searchable and also added to by community rather than those physical plaques that were at that time sort of representative of those statements by those families. But now the digital has allowed a kind of living resource to develop so that other family members and even intergenerational members could contribute part of their story and experience about that migration knowledge in their family. Along with these sort of discrete and targeted collections, a database is bringing together larger patchworks of historical migration data. The National Archive of Australia's online collections offer a consolidated space for material including passenger, citizenship and proof of arrival records and photographs. And similarly, the work of researchers has been transformed with the creation of Trove, which is part of the project of the National Library here, which has made searchable content available of over 700 digitised historical newspapers, which is a remarkable achievement and quite unique in the world because of its scale and because of the relatively recent settler history of Australia. It's actually possible to digitise most of the newspapers. I'm just sort of going through examples to give snapshots of different sorts of projects that have inspired me and show the different approaches and different possibilities of this sort of digital integration and presentation of data that's, although it's technical, it's also, as you can see, very human. Here, this was a project relating to Indigenous knowledge and oral histories. As part of the international cultural policy, the Netherlands has pioneered a shared cultural heritage program aimed at better understanding the way that Dutch culture and history have been shaped and influenced the world around it. With 10 partner countries of Australia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Japan, Russia, Sri Lanka, the United States and South Africa, this project provides digitisation funding to promote shared cultural heritage through principles of international cooperation, equality and respect. One of the greatest challenges in combining and creating large data collections is the integration of disparate data sets. Data are often drawn from entirely different sources, formats, languages and jurisdictions. Some of the most extensive work in integration has been carried out around Holocaust records. The Olsen Archives, known until 2019 as the International Tracing Service, holds the largest collection of information on Nazi victims, including documents on displaced persons, forced labour and concentration camps. In 1948, the ITS began collecting and storing individual case files and other documents in an internationally coordinated effort to institutionalise records in the interests of survivors and prosecuting perpetrators. And it was also very early to start systematically digitising records. And today, the Olsen Archives works with the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, a digital platform designed exactly for this kind of sharing of disparate data across jurisdictions and bringing it together in one place. Well, not all of that data is available in searchable format for various legal reasons and rather than technical reasons. but it is available for the most part on-site in the archives, even if not available online. So migration studies as a field is also advancing through developments in data analysis. Visualizations offer particularly striking examples of the potential for analysing and presenting migration histories. Concerned with the movement of people over time and numbers of people from various geographical and cultural backgrounds, the research field lends itself to visualizations of journeys and mass movement. The plethora of interactive digital maps of migration is evidence of this. Researchers are also using more abstract representations. Here I'm showing an example from Northeastern University where the authors have created a visualization entitled Simulated Dendrochronography of Immigration to the United States, 1830 to 2015, which illustrates population growth through the symbolic imagery of an aging tree trunk, with each ring representing a decade of growth and each cell representing 100 immigrants from a region. Researchers are also from different disciplines, and here this is really more a linguistics approach. Researchers are also using technologies to develop their own models and software for analysis. So in this work, developing a genealogical database of over 8 million names, the authors have developed a conceptual model to identify connections between historical migration patterns and intergenerational family networks across 3 case studies in the United States. They demonstrate the relative pull of different cities in attracting migrants away from their generational hinterlands across different historical periods. They illustrate, for example, the incredible pull of small mining towns during the gold rush, on par of that of large cities to attract faraway migrants. Yes, so this work is actually referring to Loretta Viola and Jaap Verheul's interactive interdisciplinary work, which combines quantitative and qualitative methods to unearth patterns in historical public discourses around migrants and migration over time. They have analysed the Times digital archive between the years 1900 and 2000 and have merged a kind of computational linguistics method with a discourse historical approach to see whether a word has changed in meaning over time. So, this is complex corpus linguistics work that they've been involved with, in which I admire. It's not my area, but it's vitally important. New forms of migrant data are also being collected, analysed and presented through digital storytelling, which is a growing narrative form. This approach offers the field more explicitly narrative-based qualitative material centred on migrant voices and subjective experiences. It was popularised in the 1990s by Joe Lambert, who founded the Centre for Digital Storytelling in California, now known as Story Centre. This has been a particularly useful approach in Australia, and our Centre for the Australian Moving Image, based in Melbourne, carried out a digital storytelling program between 2002 and 2016, co-producing hundreds of stories with members of the Victorian and wider Australian community relating to migration experiences. One of the sort of signature digital story projects in the world at that time, which a lot of others have emulated. Highly produced, co-produced documentary storytelling experiments. Independent researchers, artists and creatives with lived experience of migration are also developing their own experimental expressions of digital storytelling. And here I'm showing Matt Huyn, a Vietnamese-Australian visual artist and storyteller who's created a series of interactive comics, illustrations and animations dealing with experiences of migration in Australia and beyond. This is an extract from an autobiographical interactive comic about growing up in a suburb that was both home to a community of Vietnam War refugees in Australia and the country's heroin drug capital. Digital technologies have also deeply informed new representations of slavery histories. Now I'll start to return to the topic of slavery specifically. In 2015, the app Slavery at Monticello tells the stories of those who worked at Thomas Jefferson's 5,000-acre plantation in Charlottesville, Virginia. And these are deliberate interventions in the dominant narrative of Jefferson's life and home. In the promotional material for this app, the viewer sees an image of Jefferson and is told that, quote, history is typically told through the eyes of well-known historical figures, but that's only one perspective. So the app augments historical documents and photographs of enslaved people with interviews of their descendants, for example. In a similar vein, in 2019, the not-for-profit organisation Historic Hudson Valley released their interactive documentary, People Not Property, Stories of Slavery in the Colonial North. In response to the dominant of narrative set in the southern plantations, this online documentary explores the overlooked experiences of enslaved people in the north. Combining narrative forms with mapping, the Jamaican slave revolt map created by Vincent Brown and his team at Harvard is a striking example of contemporary digital content offering public audiences new insights into slave resistance. It's an animated and interactive digital map that details the spatial history of from 1760 to 61 of the slave revolt in Jamaica. So digital mapping is indeed a major avenue within digital migration studies more generally and offers a dynamic form of visual narrative making. Maps are often described as a form of storytelling. For our work that I'm involved with for the Western Australian Slavery Legacies project, digital mapping has allowed us to plot out geographical and temporal journeys of individuals connected to slavery based on biographical details and archival research. This has constructed a sort of digital life visual story representing the movements, encounters and places called home by an individual over time. So following this is an example of a snapshot from the sort of TLC map, the time-layered cultural map infrastructure that we've ended up using to plot out and represent some of the research findings from the slavery project. And it was decided that one of the best sort of tools within this interactive platform was the Gazetteer of Australian Place Names, which allows users to create layers on a 3D map and point to locations with accompanying information. So this enabled us to plot out the journeys of slavers and slave trade beneficiaries as they moved across Britain, the Caribbean and Western Australia. And for our data, we've selected 6 individuals so far based on those that have the most available data. The way this looks in the background, behind that kind of infrastructure before it's visualised and made public is that for each individual we created a separate layer using CSV files converted from Excel spreadsheets. And data on each individual included latitude and longitude for each place they visited or lived, place names, short biographical summary text, and links to data stored on other databases and archives. In the 3D map, this translated to a staged journey for each individual, represented by a series of points on the map. This project that is still ongoing has also used other approaches. The TLC map offered one approach that was really related to space and time and the movement of people. But another was that we wanted to write new biographies or rewrite biographies of those involved in the slave trade, including the example I'm showing here of Western Australia's first governor, a celebrated governor, until recently it was discovered that he was one of the leaders of one of the most tragic massacres of Aboriginal people, and that's been now well documented. And so our project has been helping to rewrite his biographical entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography and associated digital repositories about people and identity, such as this one, People Australia. People Australia lets a user search multiple databases to find out kind of different stories about the people that are held within them and the way that they've been represented over time. It's primarily a biographical project. And the major benefit of this is in its network analysis possibilities. Rather than being located on a map, the database allows individuals, events, institutions, and other entities to be connected to a wider context. And it also helps to show the discrepancy in the way that individuals have been described. I think this is really one of the great aspects of the digital more generally, is that it has allowed those kind of contested histories and different interpretations of individuals and events to sit side by side, but to be exposed so that you can make up your own mind about the truth or the context of those descriptions and summaries of individuals and events. Of course, often many of these entries, such as the one about James Sterling, came out of a particular time period, so we don't want to lose the kind of history of the way that people were described and the attitudes at the time in the process of rewriting. It's one of the great aspects of the digital, especially for a biographical dictionary, is that you can continually rewrite entries, but in the process you kind of write out a knowledge of attitudes at the time. So we don't want to necessarily do that. So all of this work has involved significant challenges. There are many complexities in mapping a life. It begins with choices about what information is presented and what's left out. In selecting biographical data for these initial 6 people that we've looked at through the Slave Project, we were guided by parameters including the functionality of the software that we're using. In particular, in the case of TLC Map, the data is structured around geographical and temporal coordinates. Another mandatory field was links to slavery, where brief narrative text outlined the particular family or business connections an individual held with the slave trade. But as individuals and journeys date back approximately 200 years, filling their stories with rich biographical data was not always possible, and of course main records relate to slavers rather than the slaves themselves in these histories, who are often almost completely written out of or omitted from the record. So in cases where information it wasn't known, we made estimates or notes in the fields column and would explain the limitations of our data and our process for devising estimations or for recognising omissions based on the kind of research that we'd been able to do. Tensions especially arose around power and bias tied up within the data. So we noticed the influence of colonial authorities and frameworks. Frequently the names of, as I said, of Aboriginal migrants, people of colour, were obscured or completely missing. Documents such as diaries, paintings, and indeed maps, and narratives glorified colonial exploits and laid European claims over lands. For example, when researching the life of Francis Louis Bartle, an early Western Australian colonist, and cousin to Thomas Yates of Shakespeare's slave owners, a book detailing the family history downplayed the events of the significant massacre led by one of Bustle's sons. Here I'm showing one of the letters that relate to the Bussell family and the kind of colonial bias that we found within archival documents that had been relied on for writing dominant histories. On the other hand, displaying these materials allows them to be interrogated and deconstructed, and the narrative fields within the DLC map that we used in our project were useful for these comments. We could closely examine biographies and recognise the atrocities of characters like James Sterling and the massacre that he committed. So these are just beginning points in a way to try to use digital platforms in more expansive ways, not to pretend that not to gloss over history's omissions, but to sort of reveal them and to think about new ways of narrating stories. Despite the colonial legacies of maps, many have pointed to the decolonisation potential of map making. And in her analysis of Sami activist and artist Matteson, Maria Stevenson illustrates how Matteson's maps and map-making processes construct counter-narratives that reinstate cultural narratives of the indigenous Sami people of Northern Europe. And here I'm showing the well-known map of Sapmi, produced in 1975, which presents the region through Sami people cultural and geographical terms. And it includes the use of indigenous language. It features 920 Sami frameworks and place names. Where am I going? The use of imagery and aesthetics is also a powerful means in which to navigate and challenge colonial bias. Imagery and tone was a key work in Matteson's map, the Sapmi map, but here I'm showing the work of Chris Pearce, an Australian artist of Indigenous European heritage, who takes traditional aesthetics of European landscape paintings of Australia and superimposes images such as bullseyes or land allocations created by white authorities to underscore the impacts of colonisation on Indigenous people and land. When navigating the complexities of mapping past lives, endeavouring to present rich biographical data as well as conflicting narratives, one approach might be to present multiple layers of data rather than singular layers of journeys, fixed points or static maps. And we've been experimenting with this, and I'll wrap up with showing you an image. The fluidity of digital data can also enable non-linear approaches to the presentation of that data. Although it remains at a theoretical stage, we've looked at organized data in non-hierarchized formats. In this conception, rather than data appearing through a series of stages in which work users click through on place names which then lead to more layers or hierarchies of information, data would instead all appear at once. For example, when individuals mapped our story, users would be able to begin exploration through any piece of data, not only geographical points, but all place names, images, links, and pieces of text would be given equal prominence. Our software developer, who's also a very academic, Bill Pascoe, describes this democratizing approach using the metaphor of a tree rather than presenting data in a structured hierarchy akin to branches and trunks, presenting it like a collection of leaves. So in the future, we'd like to seriously explore how these different forms of presenting data could give even more dignity and respect to the kinds of records that we're digitising and including through our research in some of these projects, and especially in our project that's related to migration. Thank you very much.